Welcome to Wild West Stories, where love blooms in the harshest landscapes and hearts find each other against impossible odds. Today's tale takes us to the Colorado Territory of 1875, where family loyalty collides with forbidden love, and a young woman must choose between everything she's known and everything she's dreamed of. This is the story of Catherine Whitmore, the banker's daughter who dared to love her father's greatest enemy. If you're ready for a tale of passion, betrayal, and the kind of love that changes everything, then settle in. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because every week we bring you stories that will touch your heart and transport you to a time when love required the ultimate courage. Catherine Whitmore pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the barn, her heart thundering as she heard her father's voice echoing from the house. If he knew she was here, meeting the man he'd sworn to destroy, it would mean more than just her inheritance. It would mean war. The autumn wind whipped through the Colorado Territory, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of a harsh winter. Catherine pulled her dark cloak tighter around her shoulders, the fine wool doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep in her bones. It wasn't the cold that made her shiver. It was the sound of boots approaching, steady and sure, across the frost-hardened ground. "You came!" Jake Morrison's voice emerged from the shadows, low and rough like gravel under wagon wheels. Catherine turned toward him, her breath catching as he stepped into the pale moonlight that filtered through the barn's broken roof. Even in the darkness, she could see the hard lines of his face, weathered by sun and worry, and the way his dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her forget everything else. Her father's warnings, the family name, the impossible chasm between their worlds. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, but her feet remained planted where they stood. Jake stopped just an arm's length away, close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the way his shoulders carried the weight of a man fighting a losing battle. "Neither should I," he said, "but here we are." The Morrison Ranch had been the talk of Silver Creek for months, though not for reasons any family would want. What had once been a thriving spread of 3,000 acres was now a shadow of its former self, picked apart piece by her father's bank. Each foreclosure notice bore the Whitmore name in elegant script. Each seized property, another nail in the coffin of Jake Morrison's legacy. Catherine had watched it happen from behind the lace curtains of her father's mansion, her heart breaking a little more with each passing week. She'd seen Jake ride into town, his jaw set with grim determination, his clothes growing more worn with each visit to the bank. She'd watched him emerge from her father's office with defeat written across his shoulders, and she'd hated herself for the part she played in his destruction. "The bank meeting yesterday," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what lay heavy on her conscience. "Your father's made his position clear," Jake said, his voice carrying no bitterness, only a tired acceptance that somehow hurt worse than anger would have. "Final payment by month's end, or the ranch becomes Whitmore property." Catherine's hands twisted in the folds of her cloak. "Jake, don't." He held up a hand, but his voice was gentle. "Don't apologize for something that's not your doing. You're not your father, Catherine." But wasn't she? Every silk dress she wore, every meal she ate, every comfortable night she spent in her feather bed was paid for by the very bank that was destroying him. The guilt sat in her stomach like a stone, heavy and cold. "There has to be something," she said, "some way to extend the terms to—" Jake stepped closer, and suddenly the space between them seemed to crackle with electricity. "There is," he said quietly, "but you won't like it." Catherine lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "Tell me." "Your father wants my land, but he wants something else more. He wants you married to Richard Ashford." The name hit her like a physical blow. Richard Ashford, her father's business partner, a man 20 years her senior with soft hands and softer morals. A man who looked at her the way other men looked at fine horses, calculating value and bloodlines. "The marriage alliance would secure your father's political ambitions," Jake continued. "Give him the influence he needs to control the territorial legislature. But if you refuse—" "He might be willing to negotiate," Catherine finished, understanding flooding through her. Jake nodded. "A man who can't control his own daughter might find it harder to convince investors he can control anything else." The plan was simple in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. If Catherine publicly refused the engagement, if she defied her father in front of the entire town, it would damage his reputation enough to give Jake leverage in their negotiations. But it would also mean the end of everything Catherine had ever known. "You're asking me to destroy my family," she said softly. "I'm asking you to make a choice," Jake replied. "Same choice I make every day, whether to keep fighting or surrender." The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the barn and sending dried leaves skittering across the floor. In the distance, Catherine could hear her father's voice calling for her, demanding to know where she'd gone. "I have to go," she said, but she didn't move. Jake reached out, his fingers brushing against hers in the briefest of touches. The contact sent fire racing up her arm, and she had to bite back a gasp. "Think about it," he said, "but don't think too long. Time's running out for both of us." Catherine pulled her hand away and stepped back, wrapping the cloak around herself like armor. "What if I say no? What if I can't bring myself to destroy everything my family has built?" Jake's smile was sad but understanding. "Then I'll lose the ranch and you'll marry Richard Ashford, and we'll both spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been." The truth of it hit her like a slap. This moment, this choice, would define the rest of her life. She could have security, respectability, everything a woman was supposed to want. Or she could have love, real love, the kind that made her feel alive in ways she'd never imagined possible. "Catherine," her father's voice was closer now, sharp with irritation. "Catherine, where are you?" "I have to go," she whispered again, and this time she forced herself to turn away. But as she reached the barn door, Jake's voice stopped her. "Catherine!" She looked back, and in the moonlight, his face was open, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "Whatever you decide," he said, "know that meeting you, loving you, it's been worth everything." The words followed her as she slipped out of the barn and hurried toward the house, her heart pounding with fear and possibility. Behind her, she could hear Jake's horse moving away into the night, carrying him back to a ranch that might not be his much longer. Inside the mansion, her father was waiting in his study, his face dark with suspicion. "Where have you been?" Edgar Whitmore demanded, his cold blue eyes scanning her appearance for any sign of impropriety. "Walking in the garden," Catherine lied smoothly, pulling off her cloak with hands that she willed to remain steady. "The air helps me think." "Think about what?" Catherine met her father's gaze with practiced innocence. "About the engagement party, of course. Richard expects an answer soon." Edgar's expression softened slightly. "Good. The sooner you accept his proposal, the better. This family needs that alliance, Catherine. Richard Ashford represents everything our future depends on." "And what about what I want?" The words slipped out before Catherine could stop them. Her father's eyes narrowed. "What you want? You want pretty dresses and a comfortable home and a husband who can provide both. Richard can give you all of that and more. But what if I want love?" Edgar's laugh was harsh. "Love? Love is a luxury for people who don't understand the world, Catherine. Love doesn't pay debts or build empires or secure futures. Love is what destroys families, what makes strong men weak and smart women foolish." "Is that what happened to you and Mother?" Catherine asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with old pain. Edgar's face went still, and for a moment, Catherine saw past the cold banker to the man who had once loved her mother with desperate intensity, only to lose her to a fever when Catherine was just 10 years old. "Your mother was different," he said finally, his voice rough. She was everything good in this world. And when she died, I learned that love is just another word for loss. I won't let you make the same mistake." Catherine felt her heart break a little for the man her father had been, even as she resolved not to become the woman he wanted her to be. "I understand," she said softly, though she understood nothing except that she was more alone than ever. That night, Catherine lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, Jake's words echoing in her mind. By month's end, it would all be over, one way or another. She could marry Richard Ashford and live the life her father had planned for her, safe and suffocating in its predictability. Or she could take a leap into the unknown, trust in a love that felt more real than anything she'd ever experienced. The choice should have been simple. It should have been obvious. But as dawn approached and the first light filtered through her curtains, Catherine knew that simple and obvious were the last things this choice would ever be. The Whitmore mansion blazed with light on the evening of October 15th, its windows glowing like beacons against the dark Colorado sky. Inside, the territory's elite mingled in the grand ballroom, their laughter and conversation creating a symphony of refined society. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on the silk wallpaper, and the scent of roses from the garden mixed with expensive perfumes and the smoky aroma of fine cigars. Catherine stood at the top of the grand staircase, her reflection multiplied in the gilt mirrors that lined the hallway. Her gown was a masterpiece of sapphire blue silk, cut in the latest fashion with a fitted bodice that emphasized her slender waist and a skirt that swept dramatically to the floor. Diamond earrings that had belonged to her mother caught the light with every movement, and her dark hair was arranged in an elaborate style that had taken her maid 3 hours to perfect. She looked, by every measure of society, like the perfect bride-to-be. Beautiful, wealthy, accomplished in all the arts that mattered to her social circle. But beneath the polished exterior, her heart hammered with the rhythm of rebellion. "Miss Catherine?" Her maid Mary appeared at her elbow with a concerned expression. "Your father is waiting." Catherine nodded, smoothing her gloves one final time. Tonight was meant to be the announcement of her engagement to Richard Ashford, the moment when her future would be sealed with champagne toasts and society's approval. Instead, it would be the night she chose her own destiny. The ballroom fell silent as she descended the stairs, every eye in the room fixed upon her. She could see Richard waiting at the bottom, resplendent in his evening wear, his pale eyes glittering with satisfaction. Beside him stood her father, his chest puffed with pride at the successful conclusion of months of careful negotiations. But Catherine's gaze swept past them both to the tall figure standing near the garden doors. Jake Morrison, dressed in his best suit, still rough around the edges compared to the other men in the room, but carrying himself with a dignity that no amount of money could buy. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and she saw him nod once, almost imperceptibly, the signal they had agreed upon. He was ready. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edgar Whitmore's voice boomed across the room as Catherine reached the bottom of the stairs. "If I could have your attention, please." The crowd gathered around them in a glittering circle, glasses raised expectantly. Catherine could see the excitement on their faces, the anticipation of witnessing a moment that would be talked about for years to come. "Tonight," Edgar continued, "I have the great pleasure of announcing the engagement of my daughter, Catherine, to Mr. Richard Ashford." Applause erupted throughout the room, but Catherine heard it as if from a great distance. Richard stepped forward, reaching for her hand with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Catherine," he said, his voice pitched to carry to every corner of the room, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" This was the moment. This was her chance to step into the life that had been planned for her since birth, to accept the security and status that came with being Mrs. Richard Ashford. All she had to do was say yes, and everything would proceed exactly as it was supposed to. Instead, Catherine stepped back. "No," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled guests. Richard's face went white, then red, his hand frozen in the air where he had been reaching for her. "Catherine," her father said sharply, his voice edged with warning, "you're overwrought. Perhaps we should—" "I'm not overwrought," Catherine interrupted, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm perfectly clear. I will not marry Richard Ashford." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. But when she looked across the room, she saw Jake's face, and the pride and love there gave her the courage to continue. "I cannot marry a man I do not love," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I will not trade my happiness for social convenience or business advantage. I am 23 years old, and I claim the right to choose my own husband." The gasps and murmurs that followed her declaration were immediate and intense. She could see the shock on faces she had known all her life, could practically hear the scandal taking root and spreading like wildfire. Richard's face had gone from red to purple. "You little fool," he snarled, all pretense of gentlemanly behavior evaporating. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? What you've thrown away?" "I know exactly what I've done," Catherine replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "I've chosen freedom over a cage, no matter how gilded it might be." Edgar stepped forward, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Catherine, you will apologize to Mr. Ashford immediately and announce that you were overcome with pre-wedding nerves. This embarrassment ends now." "No, Father." Catherine's voice was quiet but firm. "This is my choice, and I'm at peace with it." "Your choice?" Edgar's voice rose dangerously. "You think you have choices? You think this is some romantic novel where love conquers all? You are a Whitmore, and Whitmores understand duty and responsibility. You will marry Richard Ashford because that is what this family needs." "What this family needs," Catherine said, her own voice rising to match his, "is to remember that money and power are worthless without honor. What you're asking me to do, to sell myself for business advantage, where is the honor in that?" The crowd around them had begun to murmur more loudly, the shock giving way to avid interest in the very public dissolution of one of the territory's most prominent families. Catherine could see women whispering behind their fans, men shaking their heads in disapproval or secret admiration. "Get out," Edgar said suddenly, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get out of my house." Catherine felt the words like a physical blow, but she forced herself to stand straight. "Fine, but I won't go empty-handed." She turned to face the assembled crowd, many of whom had been her friends and neighbors her entire life. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the room. "You all know my father as a successful businessman, a pillar of the community. But do you know what methods he uses to build his success? Do you know about the families he's destroyed? The ranchers he's ruined with impossible loans and manipulated terms?" "Catherine, stop," Edgar warned, his face going ashen. But Catherine was beyond stopping. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam. "Right now, he's in the process of seizing the Morrison Ranch, 3,000 acres that have been in Jake Morrison's family for 20 years. Not because Jake can't pay, but because my father deliberately structured the loan to be impossible to meet." She could see the shock on faces throughout the room, could see her father's carefully constructed reputation beginning to crumble in real time. "That's not true," Richard protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Catherine turned to face him directly. "Then explain why the interest rate on Jake's loan is 3 times higher than any other rancher pays. Explain why the payment schedule was moved up by 6 months without proper notice. Explain why every time Jake tried to negotiate, he was told that only a marriage alliance between our families would secure favorable terms." The murmurs in the crowd were growing louder, more pointed. Catherine could see doubt creeping into faces that had always looked upon her father with respect and admiration. Edgar's mask finally slipped entirely. "You ungrateful little bitch," he snarled. "After everything I've given you, everything I've built for you, this is how you repay me? By destroying our family's reputation for some dirt farmer who'll never be able to keep you in the style you're accustomed to?" "Jake Morrison is worth 10 of you," Catherine shot back, "and 10 of Richard. He's honest and honorable and works for everything he has instead of stealing it from others." The gasp that followed this declaration told Catherine she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. But as she looked across the room and saw Jake's face, saw the love and admiration there, she knew she had made the right choice. "You want him so badly?" Edgar's voice was ice cold now, all pretense of paternal concern gone. "Then go to him. But understand this. You leave here tonight. You leave with nothing. No money, no dowry, no family name to protect you. You'll be nobody, do you understand? Nobody." Catherine nodded, feeling strangely free despite the magnitude of what she was giving up. "I understand perfectly." She began walking toward the garden doors where Jake waited, her silk skirts rustling with each step. Behind her, she could hear the explosion of conversation as the guests processed what they had just witnessed. But before she could reach Jake, Richard's voice stopped her. "You think this is over?" he called out, his voice ugly with rage. "You think you can humiliate me in front of the entire territory and just walk away?" I'll ruin him, Catherine. I'll ruin you both. Catherine turned back to face him, and when she spoke, her voice was deadly quiet. You can try, Richard. But remember, I know where all of my father's bodies are buried. Every crooked deal, every manipulated contract, every family he's destroyed. Push me, and I'll make sure the territorial government learns about all of it. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Catherine could see real fear creep into Richard's eyes. He knew, as they all knew, that she was serious. Without another word, Catherine walked to where Jake waited. He offered her his arm, and together they walked out of the ballroom, out of the mansion, and into the uncertain future that awaited them beyond its walls. As they stepped into the cool night air, Catherine felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Are you ready for this? Jake asked quietly as they walked toward his horse. Catherine looked back at the mansion one last time, at the warm glow of the windows and the life she was leaving behind. Then she looked at Jake, at the man who had shown her what real love could be, and smiled. I've never been more ready for anything in my life, she said. And as they rode away into the darkness, Catherine felt like she was finally coming home. The first sign of trouble came at dawn, 3 days after the engagement party that had shaken Silver Creek society to its core. Catherine woke in the small cabin on the Morrison Ranch to the sound of horses approaching at speed, their hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth like war drums. She had spent the past 3 days learning what it meant to be a rancher's woman, helping with the morning chores, cooking meals over a wood stove instead of directing servants, mending clothes by lamplight rather than ordering new ones from Denver. Her hands, once soft and pampered, were already showing calluses, and her back ached from sleeping on a straw mattress instead of her feather bed. But she had never been happier. Jake was already up and dressed, his hand resting on the rifle by the door as he peered through the curtained window. "Riders coming in fast," he said grimly. "Looks like trouble." Catherine joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she recognized the lead rider. Sheriff Tom Bradley, her father's longtime friend and business associate, was approaching with 6 deputized men behind him. Their badges glinted in the early morning light, and she could see the grim determination on their faces. "Jake Morrison!" Bradley's voice boomed across the yard as he reined in his horse near the cabin's front porch. "Come out here with your hands visible. You're under arrest." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't look surprised. "Stay inside," he told Catherine quietly. "Whatever happens, don't come out." But Catherine was already moving toward the door. "This is about me," she said. "I won't hide while you face this alone." The door opened before Jake could stop her, and Catherine stepped onto the porch with her chin held high. She wore a simple calico dress now instead of silk, her hair braided simply instead of arranged by a professional maid, but she carried herself with the same dignity she had always possessed. "Sheriff Bradley," she said calmly, "what brings you to the Morrison Ranch so early in the morning?" Bradley's weathered face was uncomfortable as he looked at her. He had known Catherine since she was a child, had attended her birthday parties and watched her grow into a woman. But his loyalty to Edgar Whitmore ran deeper than personal affection. "Miss Catherine," he said formally, "I'm here to arrest Jake Morrison on charges of theft and fraud." "What theft?" Catherine demanded. "What fraud?" "This is ridiculous." Bradley pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and held it up. "According to this complaint filed by your father and Mr. Ashford, Jake Morrison has been using forged documents to claim ownership of land that rightfully belongs to the Whitmore Bank. Additionally, he's accused of stealing cattle bearing the Ashford brand and altering the markings." Catherine felt her blood turn to ice. The charges were completely fabricated, of course, but they were clever. Cattle theft was a hanging offense in the Colorado Territory, and land fraud could result in decades in prison. Her father and Richard had crafted their revenge carefully. "That's a lie," she said furiously. "Jake has never stolen anything in his life. Those cattle have been on this ranch for years, and you know it, Tom Bradley. You've seen them yourself." Bradley's expression remained carefully neutral. "That's for a court to decide, Miss Catherine. Jake Morrison, you need to come with us." Jake stepped forward, his hands raised slightly to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. "I'll come peacefully," he said, "but I want it noted that I deny all charges. This is retaliation, pure and simple." "Jake, no!" Catherine grabbed his arm. Don't let them do this. We can fight it. We can… Catherine. Jake's voice was gentle but firm. Fighting will only make things worse. Let them take me to town. Get word to Judge Harrison. He's an honest man. He'll see through this. But even as he spoke, Catherine could see the doubt in his eyes. Judge Harrison might be honest, but he was also practical. Going against Edgar Whitmore's wishes could cost him his position, his influence, maybe even his safety. You have anything to say for yourself, Morrison? Bradley asked as his men moved to flank Jake. Jake looked directly at the sheriff, his voice clear and steady. I say that a man's character ought to speak for itself. I've never stolen anything, never lied in a business dealing, never broken my word to anyone. If that's not enough to convince 12 honest men, then this territory's in worse shape than I thought. Bradley nodded grimly and gestured to his men. Put the restraints on him. As the deputy moved forward with iron shackles, Catherine stepped between them. Wait, she said desperately. Tom, you've known me since I was a little girl. You know I'm not some foolish romantic who'd throw away everything for a criminal. Doesn't that tell you something about Jake's character? For a moment, Bradley's professional mask slipped, and Catherine saw the conflict in his eyes. But then his expression hardened again. I'm sorry, Miss Catherine, but the law is the law, regardless of personal feelings. The shackles clicked into place around Jake's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo across the empty landscape. Catherine felt each click like a physical blow, watching as the man she loved was reduced to a prisoner based on lies and manufactured evidence. How much did they pay you, Tom? She asked quietly. Bradley's face flushed red. That's enough, Miss Catherine. You're upset, and you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have in my life, Catherine replied. I'm seeing exactly what kind of men run this territory and what they're willing to do to protect their power. As the deputies prepared to load Jake into the wagon they'd brought for transport, Catherine grabbed his arm one more time. I'll get you out of this, she whispered urgently. Whatever it takes, I'll find a way. Jake's eyes were soft with love and concern, not for himself, but for her. Promise me something, he said quietly. Promise me you won't sacrifice yourself to save me. I couldn't live with that. I'm not promising anything except that I won't give up, Catherine replied fiercely. The wagon pulled away with Jake in the back, leaving Catherine standing alone in the yard of the ranch that might soon belong to her father's bank. She watched until the dust cloud disappeared over the hill, then turned and walked back into the cabin. But she wasn't planning to wait helplessly for Jake's fate to be decided by corrupt judges and bought witnesses. If her father wanted to play dirty, she would show him just how much his daughter had learned from watching him operate all these years. The first stop was the bank itself. Catherine rode into town on Jake's mare, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her everywhere now. The story of the engagement party had spread like wildfire, and she could feel the weight of judgment from every person she passed. Inside the bank, her father's office was exactly as she remembered. Rich mahogany furniture, expensive paintings, and the massive safe that held the documents that controlled half the territory's economy. Edgar looked up from his desk as she entered, without knocking, his face showing no surprise at her appearance. I wondered when you'd come crawling back, he said coldly. Ready to apologize yet? I'm ready to make a deal, Catherine replied, closing the door behind her. Edgar's eyebrows rose slightly. A deal? You're in no position to negotiate anything, Catherine. Your boyfriend is going to hang for cattle theft, and you're going to find yourself with no money, no family, and no future. Unless, of course, you come to your senses. Catherine walked to the chair across from his desk and sat down, crossing her hands calmly in her lap. Here's what's going to happen, Father. You're going to drop all charges against Jake Morrison, return his ranch, and leave us both alone. In exchange, I won't tell the territorial governor about your creative accounting practices. Edgar laughed, but the sound held no humor. You think you can blackmail me, little girl? You think I've survived this long in business by being intimidated by empty threats? Catherine reached into her reticule and pulled out a thick folder of papers. She set it on the desk between them with a soft thud that seemed to echo in the quiet room. These aren't empty threats, she said calmly. These are copies of every fraudulent contract, every manipulated loan. Every bribe you've paid in the last 5 years. I've been your dutiful daughter all my life, Father. I've sat quietly in your office, organized your files, copied your correspondence. Did you really think I didn't notice the patterns?" Edgar's face had gone pale as he stared at the folder. "You couldn't have. Those documents are locked in my private safe. A safe that I've had the combination to since I was 16, Catherine replied. "Did you forget that you trusted me with it? Your precious daughter who would never betray the family interests?" With trembling hands, Edgar reached for the folder and opened it. Catherine watched his face change as he read through page after page of carefully documented evidence. Contracts with terms that changed after signing, loan payments that were credited to the wrong accounts, correspondence with territorial officials that clearly outlined quid pro quo arrangements. "You little bitch," he whispered, but there was fear in his voice now instead of anger. "You've destroyed us both." "I've documented the truth," Catherine corrected. "What happens next depends entirely on you. Drop the charges against Jake, and these documents disappear forever. Continue this vendetta, and they get delivered to Governor Elbert tomorrow morning." Edgar was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly racing through the implications. The evidence Catherine had gathered wouldn't just destroy his business, it would likely result in criminal charges that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. "You're willing to destroy your own father?" he asked finally. Catherine felt a stab of pain at the question, but her resolve didn't waver. "You were willing to destroy the man I love based on fabricated charges. At least my evidence is real." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of disappointment and betrayal. Finally, Edgar closed the folder and pushed it back across the desk. "The charges will be dropped," he said quietly. "Jake Morrison will be released, and the ranch will be returned to him." Catherine nodded and picked up the folder. "I thought you might see reason." But as she reached the door, Edgar's voice stopped her. "This isn't over, Catherine. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've unleashed. Richard Ashford isn't a man who forgives public humiliation, and he has resources that go far beyond what you're prepared to handle." Catherine turned back to look at her father one last time. "Then I guess we'll find out how strong love really is, won't we?" As she left the bank, Catherine felt a mixture of triumph and sorrow. She had saved Jake, but she had also burned every bridge back to her old life. There would be no reconciliation with her father, no return to the comfort and security she had always known. But as she rode toward the jail where Jake was being held, she felt something she had never experienced before. The fierce satisfaction of fighting for something that truly mattered and winning. The real test, however, was yet to come. Because Edgar was right about one thing. Richard Ashford was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and his revenge, when it came, would be far more dangerous than anything her father could devise. Jake's release from jail should have been a moment of pure joy, but Catherine could see the worry in his eyes as they rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon sun. The charges had been dropped as promised, the forged evidence mysteriously disappearing from the sheriff's office, but both of them understood that this was merely the end of the first battle, not the war. "Your father's not going to forgive this," Jake said as they approached the cabin, "and neither is Ashford. We need to be prepared for whatever comes next." Catherine nodded, but her attention was focused on something else. The thin column of smoke rising from the ranch house chimney. They hadn't left a fire burning when the sheriff took Jake away that morning. "Someone's in the house," she said quietly. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the gun at his hip as they approached cautiously. But the figure that emerged from the cabin wasn't a threat. It was Maria Santos, the Mexican woman who had worked as a housekeeper for Jake's family for the past 10 years. "Senor Jake," Maria called out, relief evident in her voice. "Thank God you're safe. I heard what happened in town, so I came to make sure the house was ready for your return." But as they drew closer, Catherine could see the tension in Maria's posture, the way her eyes kept darting toward the hills surrounding the ranch. Something had her spooked. "What is it, Maria?" Jake asked, dismounting and helping Catherine down from her horse. "What's wrong?" Maria glanced around nervously before speaking. "There have been men watching the ranch, Senor Jake. Strange men, not from around here. They've been riding the perimeter for 2 days, always staying just far enough away that they can't be confronted." Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. Richard's men? Most likely, Jake replied grimly. Probably trying to figure out our routines, our defenses. They went inside where Maria had indeed prepared a warm meal and tidied the cabin. But the homey atmosphere was overshadowed by the knowledge that they were being watched, studied like prey, by hunters who were biding their time. There's something else, Maria said as they sat down to eat. A message came for you, Senorita Catherine. A boy from town brought it an hour ago. She handed Catherine a sealed envelope bearing Richard Ashford's distinctive letterhead. Catherine's stomach clenched as she opened it and read the contents. My dear Catherine, I trust you're enjoying your newfound freedom and the rustic charms of ranch life. I hope the experience is proving educational. I wanted you to know that I bear you no personal ill will. Your rejection, while publicly humiliating, has opened my eyes to certain realities about your character that I should have recognized sooner. A woman who would betray her own family for a dirt farmer is clearly not suitable to be a mother to my future children. However, there is still the matter of my damaged reputation to address. The story of our broken engagement has reached Denver, and I'm afraid it's affecting certain business opportunities that are very important to me. Something must be done to correct the narrative. I'm prepared to offer you one final chance to salvage both our situations. Return to your father's house. Announce that your recent behavior was the result of a temporary nervous condition brought on by pre-wedding anxiety, and we can proceed with a quiet ceremony within the month. I'll even be generous enough to overlook your recent indiscretions. Refuse, and I'll be forced to take more direct action to protect my interests. Your lover may have escaped manufactured charges, but there are other dangers on the frontier that are quite real. Cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, men who simply disappear in the night. The wilderness can be very unforgiving to those who don't have proper protection. I do hope you'll make the sensible choice. You have until Sunday to decide. That gives you 4 days to come to your senses. With fond regards, Richard Ashford. Catherine's hands were shaking by the time she finished reading. Jake took the letter from her and read it himself, his expression growing darker with each line. Well, he said finally, at least he's not pretending to be subtle anymore. He's threatening you, Catherine said, her voice tight with fear and anger. If I don't go back to him, he'll have you killed. Jake folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Let him try. I've been dealing with men like Richard Ashford my whole life, Catherine. Bullies who think money makes them untouchable. But Catherine could see the concern in his eyes, even as he tried to project confidence. Richard Ashford had resources that went far beyond what a struggling rancher could match. He could hire professional gunmen, corrupt officials, buy witnesses, whatever it took to eliminate the obstacle to his pride. Maybe I should go back, she said quietly. Maybe it's not worth the risk to your life. Jake's response was immediate and fierce. Don't you dare even think that. We don't negotiate with terrorists, Catherine. We sure as hell don't surrender to them. Maria, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. There might be another way, Senor Jake. My cousin Carlos works for the Ashford Ranch. He says Senor Richard has been, how do you say, indiscreet lately, drinking too much, talking too freely about his business dealings. Catherine looked up sharply. What kind of business dealings? The kind that might interest the territorial authorities, Maria replied carefully. Carlos says there have been meetings with men from the railroad company, discussions about land acquisitions that haven't been entirely legal. Jake and Catherine exchanged glances. If Richard was involved in fraudulent land deals, it would explain his recent aggressiveness about the Morrison Ranch. Land that appeared worthless for farming might be incredibly valuable if a railroad was planning to run through it. Can your cousin get us details? Jake asked. Maria nodded. He can try, but it would be dangerous for him. If Senor Richard discovers that Carlos is spying, we'll protect him, Catherine said firmly. Whatever it costs, we'll make sure he's safe. Over the next 3 days, as Sunday's deadline approached, they put together a plan that was audacious in its simplicity. Carlos would gather what evidence he could about Richard's illegal land dealings, while Catherine and Jake would document every threat, every act of intimidation that Richard's men attempted. The harassment intensified as the deadline approached. Cattle were found with their throats cut, fences were torn down in the night, and strange riders were spotted at all hours around the ranch perimeter. But Jake and Catherine documented everything, building their own case while Richard built his campaign of terror. On Saturday night, Carlos arrived at the ranch with a leather satchel full of documents he had copied from Richard's office. His hands were shaking as he handed them over, clearly terrified of what would happen if his theft was discovered. "These are contracts with the railroad company," he explained in broken English. "They show payments to officials, agreements to buy land for much less than it's worth once the railroad comes through." Catherine studied the documents by lamplight, her excitement growing as she realized what they represented. Richard had been systematically bribing territorial officials to gain advanced knowledge of the railroad route, then using that information to buy up land cheaply before the owners knew its true value. "This is fraud on a massive scale," she said. "If these documents are genuine, Richard could go to prison for decades." But Jake was studying the dates on the contracts, and his expression was troubled. "Look at this, Catherine. Some of these deals won't be finalized until after the railroad route is officially announced. If we expose Richard now, innocent people who've already sold their land might lose everything." It was a moral dilemma that neither of them had anticipated. They had the power to destroy Richard Ashford, but using it might also destroy families who had trusted him with their property. "We need more time," Catherine said. "Time to figure out how to protect the innocent people while still stopping Richard." But time was the one thing they didn't have. Sunday's deadline was less than 12 hours away, and Richard had made it clear that failure to comply would result in immediate and violent consequences. As dawn approached on Sunday morning, Catherine stood at the cabin window, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Beside her, Jake checked his weapons one final time, preparing for whatever Richard might send their way. "Whatever happens today," Catherine said quietly, "I want you to know that I've never regretted choosing you. Even if it all ends badly, these weeks with you have been the best of my life." Jake pulled her into his arms, holding her close, as if he could protect her from the world through sheer force of will. "It's not going to end badly," he said firmly. "We're going to find a way through this. We're going to build a life together, Catherine. I promise you that." But even as he spoke the words, they could hear the sound of approaching horses, more riders than had ever come to the ranch before. Through the window, they could see the dust cloud rising in the distance, growing larger by the minute. Richard Ashford had come to collect his answer, and he had brought enough men to ensure that he got the response he wanted. The final confrontation was about to begin. The sun was high and merciless when Richard Ashford rode on to the Morrison Ranch, with 12 armed men flanking him like a personal army. Catherine watched from the cabin window as they formed a semicircle in the dusty yard, their weapons prominently displayed but not yet drawn. Richard himself looked impeccable despite the dusty ride, his tailored suit and polished boots a stark contrast to the rough men he had hired. "Jake Morrison," Richard's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Send Catherine out. We have business to discuss." Jake stood beside the window, his rifle ready but held low. "Stay inside," he told Catherine. "Let me handle this." But Catherine was already moving toward the door. "Number, this is about me, and I won't hide while you face this alone." She stepped onto the porch with her head held high, wearing the same simple calico dress she had worn for days but carrying herself with the dignity of a queen. Jake emerged beside her, his rifle now casually cradled in his arms, a clear message that any violence would be met with violence. "Richard," Catherine said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Right on time. I was expecting you." Richard dismounted and walked closer, stopping just beyond the porch steps. Up close, Catherine could see the controlled fury in his pale eyes, the careful restraint of a man who was used to getting what he wanted and had no intention of being denied again. "I trust you've had time to consider my offer," he said politely, as if they were discussing a business transaction over tea. "I have," Catherine replied, "and my answer is no. I will not marry you, Richard. Not today, not ever." Richard's smile was thin and cold. "I was afraid you might say that. You always were a stubborn girl, Catherine. Too much spirit for your own good." He gestured to his men, and Catherine heard the ominous sound of guns being cocked. But instead of pointing them at Jake, the hired gunmen aimed their weapons at the cabin, the barn, the outbuildings, everything that represented Jake's life and livelihood. Here's what's going to happen, Richard said, his voice conversational despite the deadly threat implied by his actions. You're going to come with me, Catherine. We're going to ride back to town, announce our engagement, and proceed with the wedding as planned. In exchange, your lover gets to keep his ranch and his life. And if I refuse? Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. Richard's smile widened. Then this place burns. Jake Morrison dies resisting arrest for cattle theft. The charges will be refiled, of course. And you get to live with the knowledge that your stubbornness cost him everything. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Catherine could feel Jake's tension beside her, could sense him calculating odds and distances, preparing for a fight he couldn't possibly win against 12 armed men. But before anyone could act, a new voice cut through the standoff. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Ashford. Every head turned toward the ridge overlooking the ranch, where a lone figure sat on horseback, silhouetted against the sky. As the rider approached, Catherine felt her heart leap with recognition and hope. Judge Samuel Harrison, the territorial judge whose reputation for fairness was legendary throughout Colorado, rode down into the yard with calm authority. He was a man in his 60s, silver-haired and weathered, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had seen every kind of corruption and wasn't impressed by any of it. Judge Harrison, Richard said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. What brings you out to this remote location? The judge dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the armed men, the threatening posture, the obvious intimidation tactics. I received some very interesting documents yesterday evening, he said mildly. Documents that suggest certain prominent citizens have been engaging in activities that might interest a federal prosecutor. Catherine felt a surge of hope. Carlos must have gotten word to the judge, must have found a way to deliver the evidence they had gathered about Richard's fraudulent land deals. But Richard's expression remained confident. I'm sure I don't know what you're referring to, Judge, and I'm afraid you're interrupting a private family matter. Private? Judge Harrison looked around at the 12 armed men. This looks more like a military operation to me. Are you planning to start a war, Mr. Ashford? I'm planning to marry my fiancée, Richard replied smoothly. Miss Whitmore has been confused lately, influenced by unsavory elements. I'm simply here to escort her home where she belongs. Judge Harrison turned to Catherine, his eyes kind but sharp. Miss Whitmore, do you consider yourself engaged to Mr. Ashford? Absolutely not, Catherine said firmly. I publicly refused his proposal and have made my feelings clear on multiple occasions. I see. The judge nodded thoughtfully. And Mr. Ashford, are you suggesting that Miss Whitmore is not competent to make her own decisions regarding marriage? The question was a legal trap, and Richard was smart enough to recognize it. If he claimed Catherine was incompetent, he would need medical evidence and a formal competency hearing. If he admitted she was competent, he had no legal right to force her into marriage. Miss Whitmore is clearly distraught, Richard said carefully. She's not thinking rationally. She seems perfectly rational to me, Judge Harrison replied. In fact, she seems to be the only person here who isn't threatening violence. Perhaps you could explain why you felt it necessary to bring an army to propose marriage? Richard's mask of civility was beginning to slip. Judge, with all due respect, this is none of your concern. Miss Whitmore's father has given his consent to this marriage, which is all the law requires. Actually, Judge Harrison said, pulling a document from his coat, that's not quite accurate. According to territorial law, a woman over the age of 21 can refuse a marriage even with parental consent, provided she's not under legal guardianship for incompetence. Since you've just admitted Miss Whitmore is competent, your claim has no legal standing. Catherine could see the fury building in Richard's face as his carefully constructed justifications crumbled under legal scrutiny. But she also knew that a man like Richard Ashford didn't give up easily, especially when his pride was at stake. Very well, Richard said finally. If Miss Whitmore wishes to throw away her family, her future, and her reputation for a dirt farmer, that's her choice. But there are still other matters to resolve. He turned to Jake, his eyes cold with malice. The matter of cattle theft, for instance, I have witnesses who will swear that Jake Morrison has been rustling cattle from my ranch for months. Judge Harrison looked interested. Witnesses? I'd like to speak with them. Richard gestured to his men. Every man here has seen Morrison's illegal activities, but the judge's expression was skeptical. Men in your direct employ? That's convenient. I don't suppose you have any independent witnesses. Before Richard could answer, the sound of more approaching horses interrupted the conversation. This time it was Sheriff Bradley, riding with two deputies and looking distinctly uncomfortable. Judge Harrison, Bradley said as he dismounted, I got your message. You said there might be trouble out here? Indeed, there might be, Sheriff, the judge replied. Mr. Ashford here has been making some serious accusations about cattle theft. I think it might be time to investigate those claims properly. Richard's confidence was beginning to waver. That won't be necessary, Judge. I'm sure we can resolve this matter privately. I'm sure we can, Judge Harrison said firmly. Sheriff Bradley, I want you to take statements from everyone present, and I want you to examine Mr. Morrison's cattle to see if there's any evidence of brand alteration. As the sheriff began organizing his investigation, Catherine noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of Richard's hired guns, a lean man with dead eyes and a tied-down holster, was slowly positioning himself for a clear shot at Jake. She recognized the type, a professional killer who wouldn't hesitate to shoot an unarmed man if the price was right. Jake, she said quietly, nodding toward the gunman. Jake saw the danger immediately. His hand moved toward his rifle, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. Even if he could take down the professional, Richard's other men would cut him down in seconds. But before the situation could explode into violence, Judge Harrison spoke again. Mr. Ashford, he said conversationally, before we proceed with these investigations, there's something else I'd like to discuss with you. Those documents I mentioned earlier? They make for very interesting reading. He pulled out a folder that Catherine recognized, copies of the railroad contracts that Carlos had risked his life to obtain. It seems you've been very busy lately, the judge continued, buying land based on advanced knowledge of railroad routes, bribing territorial officials for inside information. The federal government takes a very dim view of that sort of corruption. Richard's face went white. Those documents are forgeries, he said desperately. I don't know where you got them, but they're completely false. We'll see about that, Judge Harrison replied. I've already sent copies to the federal prosecutor in Denver. I'm sure he'll want to investigate their authenticity very thoroughly. The threat was clear, and Richard understood that his empire of corruption was about to come crashing down around him. But a cornered animal is often the most dangerous, and Catherine could see the desperate fury building in his eyes. You old fool, Richard snarled, all pretense of civility gone. You think you can destroy me with forged papers and legal tricks? I own half the officials in this territory. I'll have your judgeship, your reputation, everything you've built. Judge Harrison smiled grimly. You're welcome to try, son. But I've been fighting corruption in this territory for 30 years, and I've outlasted better men than you. The standoff had reached a critical point. Richard's legal and financial schemes were exposed. His threats had been neutralized by the judge's presence, and his reputation was about to be destroyed. But he still had 12 armed men, and Catherine could see him weighing his options. The decision, when it came, was swift and violent. Kill them, Richard said quietly. Kill them all. The moment Richard gave the order, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Catherine saw Jake's rifle coming up, saw Judge Harrison reaching for his sidearm, saw Sheriff Bradley shouting orders that were lost in the sudden chaos. But most clearly, she saw the professional gunman drawing his weapon with deadly precision, his barrel swinging toward Jake with lethal intent. Without thinking, Catherine threw herself forward, putting her body between Jake and the gunman, just as the pistol fired. The bullet meant for Jake's heart caught her in the shoulder instead, spinning her around and sending her to the dusty ground in a spray of blood. The sight of Catherine falling seemed to break some spell that had held everyone frozen. Jake's rifle barked twice in rapid succession, and the professional gunman crumpled to the ground. Sheriff Bradley and his deputies opened fire on Richard's men, who found themselves caught between the lawman and Jake's deadly accurate shooting. The gunfight was brief but savage. When the smoke cleared, 6 of Richard's hired guns lay dead or wounded in the yard, while the rest had thrown down their weapons and surrendered. Richard himself stood untouched in the center of the carnage, his face white with shock at how quickly his plans had disintegrated. But Catherine's eyes were only for Jake, who knelt beside her in the dirt, his hands pressed against her wounded shoulder to stem the bleeding. His face was tight with anguish as he looked down at her. "You crazy, beautiful fool," he whispered. "Why did you do that?" Catherine managed a weak smile despite the pain. "Because I love you," she said simply. "Because some things are worth bleeding for." Judge Harrison appeared beside them, his medical bag in hand, a relic from his days as a frontier doctor before he'd turned to law. "Let me look at that wound," he said, gently pushing Jake aside. As the judge worked to stop the bleeding and assess the damage, Catherine could hear Sheriff Bradley reading Richard his rights. The charges were extensive: conspiracy, attempted murder, bribery, fraud, and a dozen other crimes that would likely see him imprisoned for the rest of his life. "The bullet went clean through," Judge Harrison announced after his examination. "Missed the bone and the major blood vessels. She'll heal, but she needs rest and proper care." "She'll have it," Jake said firmly, lifting Catherine carefully in his arms. As he carried her toward the cabin, Catherine could hear Richard's voice, high with desperation and fury. "This isn't over," he shouted. "You think you've won, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. I have friends, powerful friends who will abandon you the moment news of your arrest reaches Denver." Judge Harrison interrupted calmly. "I've seen it before, Ashford. Men like you only have friends as long as you're useful. Once you're exposed as a criminal, you'll find yourself very much alone." Inside the cabin, Jake laid Catherine gently on the bed, while Maria hurried to fetch clean bandages and hot water. The pain in her shoulder was intense, but it was overwhelmed by a profound sense of relief. The danger was over, the threats neutralized, and they were finally free to build the life they had dreamed of. "I thought I was going to lose you," Jake said softly, sitting beside the bed and taking her uninjured hand. "Never," Catherine replied firmly. "I didn't come this far just to give up at the end." Over the following days, as Catherine recovered from her wound, the full extent of Richard's corruption became clear. The documents that Carlos had provided led to investigations that uncovered a web of bribery and fraud stretching across 3 territories. Dozens of officials were arrested, fraudulent land deals were overturned, and families who had been cheated out of their property saw justice finally served. Edgar Whitmore, faced with the choice between cooperating with the federal investigation or facing charges himself, agreed to testify against Richard in exchange for immunity. It was a pragmatic decision that surprised no one who knew him, but it also meant that his banking empire would never recover from the scandal. As for Catherine and Jake, they were married by Judge Harrison himself in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Maria and Carlos as witnesses. Catherine wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Jake wore his best suit, the same one he had worn to the engagement party that had started it all. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked her on their wedding night as they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "Regret what?" Catherine asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Giving up everything. The money, the status, the easy life. Trading silk dresses for calico, servants for chores, a mansion for a cabin." Catherine was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. When she spoke, her voice was filled with quiet certainty. "I regret the pain I caused my father, despite everything he did. I regret that Richard's corruption hurt innocent people. But choosing you, choosing this life, I've never regretted that for a single moment." She turned to face him in the starlight. "I spent 23 years living someone else's idea of what my life should be. Safe, predictable, proper, and completely empty. These past few months, living with you, fighting for you, building something real with my own hands, this is the first time I've ever felt truly alive." Jake pulled her closer, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you, Catherine Morrison, not because you saved my life, not because you gave up wealth for me, but because you're the strongest, bravest person I've ever known." "And I love you," Catherine replied, "because you saw who I really was underneath all the silk and propriety. You saw someone worth fighting for when I didn't even see it myself." As the months passed, the Morrison Ranch prospered in ways that had nothing to do with money. Catherine proved to be a natural at ranch life, her intelligence and determination more than compensating for her lack of experience. She learned to rope cattle, break horses, and manage the books with the same precision she had once applied to organizing society events. More importantly, she found a sense of purpose that had been missing from her privileged upbringing. When the railroad finally came through the territory, bringing development and new opportunities, Catherine and Jake were among the leaders working to ensure that the benefits were shared fairly among all the residents, not just the wealthy investors. They built schools for the children of immigrant workers, established a medical clinic for families who couldn't afford doctor visits, and created a lending program that helped small farmers expand their operations without falling prey to predatory banks. Years later, when Catherine looked back on the night she had walked out of her father's mansion and into an uncertain future, she marveled at how much her life had changed. The scared young woman who had pressed her back against a barn wall, terrified of her father's anger and society's judgment, had been replaced by a confident pioneer who helped shape the future of the American West. She had given up wealth and status, but she had gained something far more valuable, a love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, a purpose that gave meaning to every day, in the knowledge that she had been brave enough to choose her own destiny when it mattered most. Standing on the porch of the home she and Jake had built together, watching their children play in the yard, while the sun set over the mountains they had claimed as their own, Catherine knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. She had traded a gilded cage for the vast freedom of the frontier, and in doing so, she had discovered who she was truly meant to be. And there you have it, the incredible tale of Catherine Whitmore, the banker's daughter who chose love over luxury and found her true strength in the process. In a world that told her a woman's worth was measured by her obedience and her marriage prospects, Catherine dared to write her own story. Her journey reminds us that sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is walk away from everything we've known in pursuit of something real and meaningful. Love, true love, isn't just about finding the right person. It's about becoming the person brave enough to fight for what matters most. Catherine's story shows us that our background doesn't define our destiny, that wealth and status are poor substitutes for authenticity and courage, and that sometimes the greatest treasure we can find is the strength to choose our own path, no matter the cost. If this tale of frontier love and feminine courage moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Catherine's place? Could you have walked away from everything you'd ever known for love? And make sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories and ring that notification bell, because every week we bring you tales of passion, adventure, and the indomitable human spirit that tamed the American frontier. From forbidden romances to tales of survival against impossible odds, we've got the stories that will transport you to a time when love required the ultimate courage. Until next time, remember, the best stories aren't just entertainment, they're inspiration. They remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have the courage to follow their hearts. Thanks for watching Wild West Stories, where love always finds a way, even in the harshest landscapes. We'll see you next week for another unforgettable tale from the frontier.